A very warm welcome to the Iscia seminar, What Were We Thinking? This is the fourth presentation in the series for this year, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Aragorn Eloff as our guest presenter today. Aragorn is a PhD candidate with the Northwest University, and his current work concerns the philosophy of psychedelics and the psychedelic experience, broadly speaking. Where Aragorn has been developing the notion of psychedelic ontogenesis. So in today's talk, which is entitled Our Strange Attractions, Psychedelics, Individuation, and Some Ways to Dismantle the Dogmatic Image of Thought, Aragorn's going to talk us through and explore with us what he refers to as dynamic systems theory, DST, which I understand to be a Deleuzian model, if you like, as a way of thinking differently, as a way of offering a way of thinking about individuation as ontogenesis. So in Aragorn's work, in this particular talk, he's going to look at or respond to what Deleuze Deleuze talks about as the dogmatic image of thought, as a sort of hegemonic way of thinking or mode of relating to the world in terms of formal identities and fixed identities and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'll push you over to Aragorn and listen to what he's got to say about dynamic system theory. So over to you, Aragorn. Thank you very much.
Okay, awesome. I'm just going to start sharing my screen straight away. Let's see. Let me try this a little bit differently. Okay, can everyone see my presentation?
Excellent, yes.
Okay. And I should just say before I start, I've got a little bit of a cold, so if I kind of sniffle all the way through, please just try ignore that. But Emma did a great job of introducing what I'm going to talk about today. Psychedelics aren't going to be a kind of central feature of what I'm talking about. Sorry, Vanna, but they're definitely going to enter in during some point. But essentially what I'm going to be talking about is what Deleuze calls the dogmatic image of thought. And I'm going to give a kind of rough little outline of that. And then I'm going to think about ways in which we can think differently, ways in which we can think differently about thinking. So you'll see a lot of this talk gets sort of really recursive and starts eating its own tail, because I think that that's a fundamental part of what thinking is, right? Let me see if I can just, okay. So I think Emma's given a sort of really good summary of what I'm currently busy with and what the talk's going to be about. But I want you guys all to have a look at the little image on the right-hand side of the screen. It's a little two-dimensional grid, and it's got a bunch of arrows on it, and it's a coordinate space. So there's an X coordinate and a Y coordinate, and these arrows are moving around in this space. And what these arrows are is a vector field. A vector field is something that's used within dynamic systems theory, and it's meant to show what a system does over time and what the tendencies of a system are over time. And we're going to get back to that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what a vector field is and why it's important when we're thinking about thinking. But I just wanted you guys to have this image in your head already as we start. So just think about what this represents, that this represents what a system is doing over time. Okay. But very importantly, if we're being critical of the dogmatic image of thought, what is it we're talking about? I think we all know what dogma is, but what does Deleuze mean by the dogmatic image of thought? This is a term he comes up with in his book, Difference and Repetition, which is his doctoral thesis, and which kind of sets the groundwork for all the philosophy that comes after that. It's the first book that he writes in his own name, which is not a sort of book on another philosopher, and where he unpacks his own philosophy. And it's a very kind of arcane and challenging book. And it actually talks a lot about some stuff that you'll see emerging in a whole lot of the different sort of contemporary scientific fields I'm going to be covering later in the talk. But the sort of central axis around which the whole book revolves is the middle chapter, which is on the dogmatic image of thought. So what does Deleuze mean by this? So in his own words, what he says is that when we think according to a given method, and also according to a more or less implicit, tacit, or presupposed image of thought, which determines our goals and our methods when we try to think, right? So every time we try to think and think about thinking, there's a certain kind of a priori structure that inhibits or encourages certain kinds of thinking. And Deleuze is very interested in the different sort of ways in which this comes to influence thought, especially the more sort of subtle ways in which this can come to influence thought, right? So I think we all know what it is to hold a particular ideology or a certain set of dogmas, but there are more nuanced and subtle ways in which the dogmatic image can come to inhibit the ways in which we can think and the possibilities of thought, right? And Deleuze unpacks these in terms of what he calls the eightfold critique of the dogmatic image of thought, right? So he says that there are 8 principles or postulates that he finds particularly sort of central in inhibiting thought and its possibilities. And this is a problem. It's not just an abstract sort of technical or philosophical problem. It's a really real political problem for Deleuze. Because the way he says it is that when we thinking within the constraints of the dogmatic image of thought, in his words, it gives us a Western democratic popular conception of philosophy as providing pleasant or aggressive dinner conversation at Mr. Rorty, by which he's referring to the philosopher Richard Rorty, right? So he's pointing out this way in which philosophy can turn into what's sometimes called court philosophy. You know, in the king's court, you have the jester, and the jester performs in a certain sort of humorous way and tells certain jokes, but they're always meant to make the king feel good. If the jester starts making the king feel bad, there's a problem. He's probably going to be executed, right? And Deleuze says this happens in philosophy as well, right? When we're thinking within the dogmatic image of thought, we're perpetuating what currently exists in the world, the current set of assumptions, the current set of biases and prejudices, and we're unable to think the new, right? So we end up performing court philosophy. We end up doing something that's the performance of thought, but that merely reproduces the status quo. And Deleuze says this in a very wonderful way. He says, what is a thought which harms no one? In this thought that harms no one, thought rediscovers the state, it rediscovers the church, and it rediscovers all the current values that it subtly presented in the pure form of an eternally blessed and unspecified eternal object, right? So what he's saying there is that when we're thinking within the dogmatic image of thought, we're taking a very contingent, limited, socio-historical circumscription of thinking, and we're trying to reify that and say that that is the full scope of possibility of thinking, right? And we're never going to get out of the bind of the present if we do that. So for Deleuze, the first principle of philosophy instead is that universals explain nothing but must themselves be explained. So all these a priori assumptions that we bring into our thinking about the world and about ourselves, those need to be unpicked and seen for the contingencies that they are. They're things that are situated in very specific social and historical ways. But let's look a bit at these 8 principles, right? So these get quite technical, but in a very simple way, what Deleuze is doing here is he's critiquing 2 things. First of all, he's critiquing identity, and second of all, he's critiquing transcendence, right? So if we think about the first one of those things, identity, Deleuze says that in thought and in thinking about the world, and this is in fact what the whole of his book, Difference and Repetition, is about, we tend to assume that identity is primary, right? There's a bunch of stuff in the world. Each of those things in the world has a certain label attached to it, and we can extend this principle to thought as well. The way we think has a certain sort of structure. Our minds and our brains are a set of sort of identities that connect to each other in certain ways and operate according to certain functional principles. And this for Deleuze is highly problematic because it doesn't account for how those identities come to be in the first place, right? Deleuze talks about this in terms of what he calls good and common sense. And what he says is that the typical way in which we think, if we're thinking within the dogmatic image of thought, is that we think the world is nice and neatly parceled out, right? That there's an ontology of middle-sized dry goods where everything has a distinct border and is always going to be itself and is distinct from various other things around it, and that this forms the basis for thinking. This forms the basis for understanding what there is in the world and what the relations between the things in the world are, right? And those relations become subordinated or secondary to identities. But this becomes circular because how do those identities arise in the first place? And when Deleuze starts developing his ideas of ontogenesis and individuation, we'll see that identity is actually always subordinate to difference, to continuous differentiation that gives rise to identity, but that also underlies it. So Deleuze will say the way in which the world is packaged out into this sort of ontology of middle-sized dry objects has a correlation in what he calls common sense, which is that we've got these different faculties of thought. We've got sensibility, imagination, reason, and all these kinds of things, the kinds of things Kant used to talk about. And we assume that there's a harmonious relationship between those things and between those things and stuff in the world. And so that it's easy to think, right? That we go and we encounter an object in the world, we pick up a little thing in the world and we say, this is an orange, and we sense the same orange that we imagine and reason about. And between our sensory faculties and the real world, there's a nice and easy and neatly packaged out relation. And Deleuze is really critical of this idea. And he'll talk instead about the discord between the faculties and the fact that there's a kind of violence that gives rise to thought and that causes a kind of rupture between the different faculties of thought. The object that we perceive and sense is not necessarily the same object that we reason about or imagine. But we'll get a little bit more into this. This extends into what Deleuze calls the principle of recognition. And recognition, if you think about it, the sort of quintessential form of recognition within the dogmatic image is this really sort of classic Greek principle of the law of identity. You know, in classic Greek philosophy, there's a law of identity where A is equal to A. There's the law of non-contradiction. And, you know, A can not be A and not A at the same time. And there's the law of the excluded middle, right? Something is either A or B. It can't be something in between, right? So we're used to things being neatly packaged out. We're used to the world being composed of a bunch of things that have little labels attached to them, and that informs the parameters of our thought. This gives rise to what Deleuze calls representation, right? Where we start thinking about things in terms of other things, in terms of something's identity, its analogy with something else, its resemblance to something else, or its opposition with something else. Deleuze he's actually quite prescient in this. You know, this book, Difference and Repetition, was written in 1968, and his critique of representation here is also a critique of what in cognitive science is called functionalism. You know, it's the school of thought that came out around sort of Chomsky and Fodor and Pilishin and people like this in the 50s and 60s, which views brains as little computers that have a bunch of little functions that operate on information and create and consume representations, right? It's a really sort of trite model of cognitive functioning that relies a lot on what early computers did, and it's still kind of dominant in cognitive science. But most of the critiques around it emerged a lot later than Deleuze's book. So he's almost anticipating a lot of those critiques in his discussion of representation here, in his discussion of good and common sense. If you want to think of a contemporary example of good and common sense and recognition, you can think of how machine learning works. We have a little computer program that recognizes pictures of cats. It's using that principle of good and common sense to think about a distribution of identity in the world. Okay, so those are the first four principles, and Deleuze has a second four principles, which kind of reiterate the first four, but think about the ways in which they're expressed in our shared world, right? So he'll talk about the principle of the negative or error, where thought is constrained to thinking what is true or false, right? And often this is the test of thought. We do these sort of quizzes in school all the time, and we think about thinking in terms of, am I right or wrong about a certain thing? And this is a really sort of impoverished form of thought for Deleuze. It might be good if you're answering a radio quiz to win a prize, but when the possibilities of thought are circumscribed by this idea of the negative or error, right, of thought being true or false, it doesn't allow for what Deleuze calls the involuntary adventures of thought, right? It doesn't allow for hallucination or madness or all these different ways in which thought can go wrong. And also the more banal ways in which thought can go wrong, simply by just thinking the ordinary or the banal itself. Deleuze is also critical of the idea of the proposition, right? That there's a very easy relationship between thought and reference, right? I think about something, and then I can designate that thing in the world, and it has a very sort of unified sense around that designation. This is the sense-reference paradox, which goes right back to Frege. And for Deleuze, he works this out in a lot more detail in the logic of sense. There's a kind of circularity to this. There's a circularity of reference. And so when thought is thinking within the dogmatic image, it's prone to lapsing into these kinds of circularities of reference as well. Deleuze then develops this into the seventh principle, which he calls the principle of modality or solutions. And this one's pretty straightforward. What Deleuze says is we often meant to think about the world as though the problems are already pre-given, right? Or at the very least, the structure of the problems we face within our lives is pre-given, and that the only kind of salient thing is to figure out solutions to those pre-existing problems. So problems are given ready-made, and we just have to find the right or the most optimal answers to those problems. But what is a problem in the first place? It's also a set of assumptions about what there is in the world and how that thing that there is in the world functions. The principle of identity already intervenes in how these ready-made problems are constructed. So if we don't have the power to think about and construct the problems for ourselves, then we're always going to get the solutions we deserve based on how we're constructing problems. And Deleuze actually has a very technical definition of what a problem is, which we'll get to when we look at dynamic systems. But for Deleuze, it's a lot more important to think in terms of problems and the construction of better problems than to think in terms of solutions. And then the final principle of the dogmatic image is the principle of the end or knowledge. The idea that knowledge is some sort of finite accumulation of facts, and that we sort of filling an empty vessel. This is the sort of the Freirean critique of knowledge as well. And for Deleuze, this should be subordinated to learning as the exploration of an open space of possibility. So this is Deleuze's eightfold critique. This is what Deleuze thinks the sort of 8 core features of the dogmatic image of thought are, right? Let me summarize it in his words, though. Conceptual philosophical thought has as its implicit presupposition a pre-philosophical and natural image of thought borrowed from the pure elements of common sense. According to this image, thought has an affinity with the true. It formally possesses the true and materially wants it. It is in terms of this image that everybody knows and is presumed to know what it means to think. Thereafter, it matters little whether philosophy begins with the object, so maybe Plato's world of ideal forms, or with the subject, maybe Descartes looking at his piece of wax, or with being or with beings, as long as thought remains subject to this image which already prejudges everything, the distribution of the object as well as the distribution of the subject, as well as that of being and beings. We may call this image of thought a dogmatic, an orthodox, or a moral image of thought. So one good way of thinking about this, one very clear way of thinking about this, and of Deleuze's critique of the dogmatic image, is that when we're thinking in terms of the dogmatic image, we're thinking of the individuated. We're thinking of being as a kind of final stabilization of what is in fact something in process, something that's always becoming, something that's always individuating. You know, we inhabit a moving reality. The world is always in flux. Things are always changing. We're surrounded by all sorts of complex nonlinear dynamisms. But when we think, we like to think in terms of a final world of fixed and formed objects. So we're thinking in terms of the individuated, which for Deleuze, he'll call it, after Simondon, a single phase of being. When we're thinking in terms of the individuated, we're thinking in terms of one phase or one snapshot or one moment of being, which is actually a system in perennial becoming. And what he'd like to do instead, and this is a huge part of Deleuze's overall project, is to think in terms of becoming. So to think in terms of individuation itself. What are the principles that give rise to the given? So instead of just thinking of the given, of the individuated, how do we think of how the given is given? So of all those individuative dynamisms that give rise to the given. So this is where it gets interesting, because this is where Deleuze talks about individuation in a way very, very similar to how dynamic systems theory speaks about individuation. So here's one way in which he says it, which I think is quite clear. Knowledge is, here he's talking about knowledge in the sense that he's thinking about it in terms of individuation. Knowledge is nothing more than an empirical figure, a simple result, which continually falls back into experience. Whereas learning is the true transcendental structure which unites difference to difference, dissimilarity to dissimilarity, without mediating between them, and introduces time into thought. I like this idea of introducing time into thought, right? Deleuze is thinking individuation, what gives rise to the individuated. He's trying to think the becoming that gives rise to being. So he's trying to think of introducing time into thought. And that's precisely what dynamic systems theory does. Dynamic systems theory is a way of trying to think about what happens when we introduce time into how we look at a system. Okay, but what is dynamic systems theory? So this is where it gets pretty wild, but I'm going to give a really, really sort of quick overview. And if any of you are super interested in this, you can kind of go Google it for yourselves afterwards, and you'll find there's a wealth of resources online about what dynamic systems are. But essentially, dynamic systems are a way of modeling the behavior of a system over time. So that system could be the weather, it could be thought, it could be the migration patterns of swallows, it could be how computers work, it could be computer networks, it could be the ocean tides, it could be astrophysics, it could be particle physics. Any system that we can look at in the world in some or other way, whether directly or through some sort of experimental devices, we can model using dynamic systems theory. And it's a way of modeling what that system is doing over time. So the simplest example of this, if you look at the top right of this slide, if you're modeling this simple little thing, this little lever that goes up and down with the red square on it, if you're modeling that as a dynamic system, there are two parameters. There's speed and there's position. Those are the two things that are happening there. There's a speed that's changing and there's a position that's changing. And if you had to give each of those an axis within a two-dimensional space, an X and a Y, and label one of them velocity and the other one position, you're going to end up with a phase diagram, with a drawing of what happens in the system over time, that in this case is just a simple little circle, right? So it's a very linear system, this. It's not very interesting. It's got a loop attractor or a cycle attractor. The attractor is the tendency of that system over time. So the attractor is that blue circle, and that little green dot, if you guys can see it, is any given point in that system, any given snapshot in time of that system. So you can see over time, it draws that little blue circle, which is the attractor of that system. But you can obviously see, if you look around on the slide, other systems have much more complex dynamics. They draw much more complex attractors over time. And some of them draw very chaotic attractors. So just below that very simple example, you'll see there's a pendulum with two arms. And that's pretty chaotic. There's no way to predict that system at any given point in time. We can't, without letting the system run, predict what it's going to do next. It's very chaotic and nonlinear. If we change the starting position of those two arms just by 1 millimeter, it's going to draw a totally different thing. Whereas the thing above it, the little up and down mechanism, we can predict it with a pretty high level of certainty. It's a very linear system, right? Small perturbations aren't going to create big changes. If that little red box starts in a different position on its up and down axis, it's still going to end up drawing that same little circle attractor, right? So we talk about point and loop and cycle attractors and all these kinds of things when we're speaking about very linear and simple systems, and we speak about chaotic attractors when we're speaking about more complex systems. But what you can see, if you look towards the bottom left, especially when we're looking at stuff like what's called the Lorentz attractor, is that some of these things exhibit quite profound patterned behavior, right? There's an interesting attractor space that's been drawn out as this little system moves over time, as that little dot, which is a system at any given point in time, as it navigates through time, it's constructing a very interesting phase space or phase diagram. And these are the kinds of systems that we encounter mostly in the real world. We encounter complex nonlinear systems that are neither completely random or what's called stochastic, and that aren't totally linear and predictable either, right? So they have a certain amount of complex dynamism to them, but they exhibit certain tendencies over time. So we can't exactly predict where that system is going to be over time, but we do know what its tendencies over time are. We do know that it's probably going to navigate roughly the same trajectory. So if we think about this, here's an interesting little two attractor phase space where the system tends to be in one of two states. And let's think about this as a very simple system. Let's say this is my cat. And my cat is a very, very simple system. It's usually in one of two states. My cat is usually either eating or sleeping, right? So if you look at the little dot on the right, that's my cat when it's sleeping. The little dot on the left is my cat when it's eating. And if you observe my cat at any given moment of the day, it might be in some other state. It might be in between those two attractors. But typically, it's pretty lazy and it's pretty hungry. And if it's not sleeping, it's eating. So my cat maps out a pretty interesting attractor space over time with certain strong tendencies that allows me to kind of predict the behavior of my cat. Of course, if my cat got sick or there wasn't any food or there were loud noises keeping my cat awake, something else might start happening. There might be a bifurcation. There might be a change in that attractor space. The parameters that set up that phase space might start changing enough that a different attractor layout started unfolding. And then my cat might start mapping out a different set of tendencies over time based on that bifurcation, based on that shock to the system that pushed my cat into a new trajectory. But of course, over time, my cat's probably going to stabilize back to the same trajectory unless I'm starving my cat or sadistically keeping him awake. And just in case, often with these kinds of mathematical systems, it's easy to think of them as very abstract, but dynamic systems are also exemplified all over the real world. Emma did a great talk a couple of weeks back where she showed a lot of examples of this, how we get all these sort of fractal structures, and fractals are examples of dynamic systems. We get all these fractal structures occurring in nature because of the tendencies of expression of systems over time. So any sort of biological system will express itself in certain ways over time that often have sort of complex patterned behavior because of the set of dynamisms, the set of sort of parameters that system finds itself in. So hopefully that makes sense so far. The important thing here is that this is how Deleuze thinks about thinking. This is how Deleuze thinks about what there is in the world. It's not in terms of this fully formed set of linear objects that we can predict the behavior of and that has a strict identity. It's in terms of these phase spaces that have these attractor layouts on them that define the potentials and the tendencies of systems over time, right? So when we're thinking or we're trying to understand a certain phenomenon in the world, when we're thinking about it in terms of individuation, in terms of a thought without an image, if we're trying to escape representation, then we're just thinking about phase spaces, topologies, attractor layouts, dynamisms, and of course, the possibility for a system to bifurcate, right? For the new to become possible. So there are various, in order to make that idea clearer though, there are various other fields in which dynamic systems theory is being used within contemporary science. And the first one is in contemporary cognitive science, especially within what's called enactive cognition. And enactive cognition kind of takes its ideas from autopoiesis, which is this classic idea in systems biology about self-making systems. What autopoiesis says is that any living system that endures as a system kind of has to define itself in relation to an environment, and it's kind of complexly entangled with that environment. On the one hand, it needs that environment to sustain itself, right? We all live within a world, and we all open to flows from that world, from that environment. Just think about our metabolism, for instance, the fact that we have to breathe in oxygen from the air, we have to eat food. This is true of all living systems. They're always open to the environments in certain ways, but they also have to distinguish themselves from that environment in certain ways. Otherwise, they just dissipate into the environment, and then they're not a system anymore. Then they're not something that we would speak about in terms of being an agent or a subject or a living being, right? So autopoiesis, especially on the contemporary enactive view, has to navigate this careful tension between what's called self-distinction and self-production, between closedness and openness. And a lot of enactive theorists map this out in terms of living systems navigating these attractor spaces, right? We find ourselves in this world with a whole lot of tendencies and dynamisms and certain formations of habit and certain possibilities to overcome those habits. So we're always exploring an attractor layout. We're always exploring that phase space and either getting stuck within those very limited cycles within the phase space, or being able to bifurcate out of those very limited cycles and explore other spaces, right? So our attractors, our behavior over time as these kinds of systems will manifest certain kinds of patterned behavior. It won't be totally random, but it probably won't be totally deterministic either, because the world is always changing around us. We're always precarious agents, right? We're always adapting to flux in the context in which we find ourselves. This is true of life, and this is true of thought as well. So very often, however, we get stuck in habits. We get stuck in very sedentary, entrenched ways of doing things. And another field in which dynamic systems theory is used very usefully, and this is a core part of my PhD research, is in psychedelics research. And a lot of psychedelic therapy thinks about interesting ways in which we can precisely get people out of these sort of binds of very entrenched patterns of behavior that might not be suiting their purpose as well. If we've developed bad habits and we have obsessive patterns of behavior, for instance, or we're stuck in cycles of depression or whatever it is, whatever our sort of constraints are of our behavior that we'd like to overcome, psychedelics have for a very long time been seen as one way to sort of come to grips with and move past these very entrenched patterns of behavior. Andrea, how long do I have left?
Sorry, you have about 10 minutes or so.
10 minutes. Okay, great. I just don't want to rush through too much.
5?
Okay, cool. So a lot of contemporary psychedelics research has noticed that when people take LSD or psilocybin mushrooms or whatever, they're more able to gain insights into patterns of behavior that might not be serving them well, and able to kind of contract new patterns of behavior, to sort of work through some of those binds that keep them stuck in certain ruts, and to be able to shift to more optimal ways of living and being in the world, right? Anyone who's taken psychedelics kind of knows that's the case. Of course, we also know that psychedelics can construct even more toxic forms of obsessive and patterned behavior if we do it wrong. But there's a whole lot of really interesting neuroscientific research that's showing that psychedelics really do have this effect on the brain. So what they do is they flatten what's called the brain's energy landscape. They slow down the functioning of the default mode network, which is this sort of very looped, structured kind of default behavior of the brain that keeps our systems kind of operating as systems. And they allow for more noise, more bottom-up information, more messy cross-brain kind of crosstalk that allows us to kind of see things differently and come up with novel solutions to problems, and also not see our current problems as necessarily as deep as we might assume they are. I'm using this term deep in a very literal way, because another way of modeling dynamic systems is as these kinds of energy landscapes. So if you look at the left of this slide, you'll see you've got this little landscape of sort of hills and valleys. And if you think about those valleys and the little red dots in them, these are states that we can find ourselves in, right? And if you think of a habit could be like a really deep valley. So we could start anywhere within this landscape, and we've got a tendency to roll downhill into one of these deep valleys and find ourselves in this very strong attractor, right? Let's say we're suffering from depression, right? Depression could be a very deep attractor state. We roll down from whatever starting position we find ourselves in, and we have a strong tendency to end up in that state. And what psychedelics do is they kind of flatten that landscape. You can see this on the right-hand side, where you look at what's called the transition energy between two different states. If you imagine those little hills and valleys becoming less steep, it's easier to roll in and out of those spaces, right? So we're literally flattening the attractor landscape. We're slowing down those sort of tendencies and dynamisms. And we're allowing for the possibility of new tendencies and dynamisms to start unfolding. So psychedelics can be a very useful way of thinking in terms of these attractor spaces and thinking of them not just as these sort of transcendent and imposed perennial structures that inhibit our thought in certain ways and our possibilities, but that things that are themselves malleable, right? We can transform those attractor spaces. We're not bound by the landscape we find ourselves in. We're able to some extent to conform that landscape. It's always a landscape that's inhabited by others, right? We're always part of a world. We're always navigating that tension between openness and closure. But to some extent anyway, we have some agency over those landscapes. So here's where it gets really interesting. Usually the ways in which we think about the world, and we think about cause and effect, right? So when we're thinking about our agency to be able to change things, for instance, we tend to think in these really sort of reductionist ways, right? We parcel out the world into a very discrete little ontology of material things, and each of those material things has very strict sort of efficient causes, and often we'll reduce those causes down to things like physics, for instance, right? And we'll say that everything else just supervenes on physics. Everything else is just an epiphenomenon or an emergent property of physics. So if you think about complex systems in that way, you think about those dynamic systems and those attractors, when we're thinking in a reductionist way, those attractors don't really have any kind of reality, right? They're not these physical, simple things that we can point out to in the world. They're not like physics. We can't do a kind of simple experiment using efficient cause where we collide one attractor into another attractor and see what the outcome is in a laboratory or something like that, right? Attractors are part of this sort of speculative idea of emergence, of what complex systems are, of what dynamisms emerge when all the stuff that makes up the world starts interacting with all the other stuff that makes up the world in these non-linear ways, right? What are the tendencies that emerge? What are the attractor spaces that emerge? And how do we think about the reality of those attractor spaces, right? So when we're thinking about the brain in those attractor spaces, or we're thinking about the climate or any other system that we can imagine, those attractor spaces seem to have some kind of reality. If we can run a system 100 times, if we can observe the same ecological system 100 times in a row, and it maps out the same paths or similar paths, it maps out the same attractor structure every time we look at it, then it feels like that attractor layout, that emergent property, has some kind of reality of its own. But it's not a reality of efficient cause. It's something else. It's what Alicia Juarrero, who's a complex systems theorist, and I really recommend everyone read this book. It's the most profound book I've read in ages. It's what she calls emergent constraint regimes. So she says that, sure, there's the material world and there's efficient cause within the material world, but that efficient cause, all the stuff that happens in the world, happens within the broader context of these emergent constraint regimes. So all the sort of physical stuff interacts with each other. It gives rise to these emergent properties that then constrain or enable the possibilities of those systems that gave rise to the constraints in the first place. There's something very nice and circular here. It's just like autopoiesis, right? Systems give rise to themselves and the dynamisms that perpetuate themselves. In the same way, for Juarrero, we can think about these emergent constraint regimes, these attractor layouts, these dynamic spaces, as these very real spaces of potential that constrain and enable systems over time. And again, these are not things that we're totally beholden to. They're not completely determining our behavior, but neither are we completely free to determine our own behavior either. We're always operating within the context of these broader sort of imbricated tendencies that involve not just ourselves, but the entire complex ecosystemic contexts we find ourselves in. So what Juarrero says is that constraints sculpt a rugged and multi-dimensional landscape, the possibility and probability space of what can happen at all, what will most likely happen, and when it cannot, can, or must happen. This possibility space can be conceived on the analogy of an epigenetic landscape. The conditional probability of individual events changes because their constrained interactions deform possibility space and thereby bias what can and cannot happen next, what can and must happen, and so on. Okay, and this idea has also gained a lot of traction in systems biology. This is also a lovely new book by Aragorn called Organism-Oriented Ontology. It's a little bit of a poke at object-oriented ontology, which was this like real white bro philosophy thing from a few years ago, which wanted to think about the world in an object-oriented programming kind of way, very loosely speaking. And organism-oriented ontology is a very beautiful challenge to that thinks about our sort of deep imbrication with all these complex flows and dynamism that make up the world around us, right? So organism-oriented ontologies are all about multiplicities and potentialities and processualities. It's all about becoming. It's all about traversing those trajectories through those phase spaces and mapping out those attractors and learning about those attractors and figuring out ways to change those attractors, to bifurcate those attractors, and thinking about the ways that those attractor spaces intersect in nested and complex and nonlinear ways with all sorts of other attractor spaces, right? Because everything we encounter in the world through those sort of practices of self-distinction and self-production has its own attractor space. Every part of the environment has its own attractor space, and the environment collectively has an attractor space, right? So we're always dealing with these nested and recursive attractor spaces of potential and probability and possibility and processuality. This is what the idea of multiplicity means. It's also what the idea of assemblage in Deleuze means. So what are the implications of all this? So this idea, which started off in Deleuze, and which we can now see sort of being expressed in all these different fields, right? In cognitive science, in systems biology, in formal ontology, and everywhere else, and in psychedelics research, kind of really challenges the dogmatic image as this way of thinking about the world in terms of identities and in terms of simple, linear, non-nested, discrete systems that can be thought about in isolation, right? And that have these fixed identities. All these new sort of fields that all interestingly model their outcomes using the same framework of dynamic systems theory instead want us to think about the possibilities of thinking in life in terms of nested, quasi-causal, complexly entangled, emergent, dissipative, non-linear systems, individuating precariously within recursive networks of cascading constraint regimes as non-exhaustive actualizations of a res potentia or a pre-individual fund. Now, that last bit of res potentia or pre-individual fund, this comes from Deleuze and Simondon, who was a philosopher of science who was a big influence on Deleuze. And he also wanted to think in terms of individuation. Instead of just the individuated as one phase of being, he wanted to think about what underlies the individuated and what the potentials are that allow us to individuate otherwise. So the pre-individual fund is all that stuff that's in excess of what we currently are, but that defines the possibilities, the very real material potentials, the res potentia of what we could be, right? So we're one given actualization. We're one moment in that phase space. And that phase space itself, that attractor layout, is also one possible distribution of attractor layouts. And it doesn't exhaust the possibilities of the pre-individual funds, right? And this is probably the most insidious aspect of the dogmatic image of thought, is that it's an exhaustive kind of thinking. It thinks in terms of what is, and not in terms of what's becoming. It thinks in terms of the given and not in terms of that by which the given is given. So this in turn allows us to think about some very deep philosophical questions in a new way. Obviously, we're not just thinking about ontology anymore. We're thinking about ontogenesis, what gives rise to identity. We're not just thinking about epistemology as things like the law of the excluded middle and identity and non-contradiction, but we're also able to think about what gives rise to the terms that we navigate in order to verify the foundations of knowledge in the first place. Instead of thinking of transcendental norms that are going to be the same for all time in all places, we're thinking in terms of a situated experimental ethics of provisional experimentality, right? And ethics is always going to be situated in the distribution of tendencies and possibilities in which it finds itself. So there's no moral normativity in this new way of thinking. And of course, we're thinking about a consciousness and thus a way of thinking that's beyond the sort of really boring old cognitive science, representationalist, functionalist, internalist model of thought, which is really just bad computer programming. So if there's one situated immanent ethics to take from this, read a bunch of Deleuze, take a bunch of psychedelics, take them very carefully, enact your collective becomings, deterritorialize. This is what Deleuze means by individuating, right? If we want to redistribute that attractor space, if we want to forge other tendencies and potentials, if we want to become otherwise, then we need to deterritorialize, or in psychedelic speak, we need to flatten that energy landscape. We need to smooth space, and we need to become differently. We need to counter-actualize. And Deleuze says this in a very beautiful way at the end of Difference and Repetition. He says that there are two kinds of games. He talks about the throw of the dice, and he talks about the two different kinds of games that we can play. And he says, look, we can play the established game, the game of identity, and that's the game that takes place within the established or the individuated, where we're merely redistributing what there is in the world. But we can also play the infinite game, which is the game of bringing forth into the world. And this is the game where to throw the dice is to enter into a problematic field. And by the problematic field, we can think in terms of these phase spaces. And that's how we allow for new individuations or events to take place. This is the practice of vice diction or counter-actualization. And this is the creation of concepts or the creation of new problems, right? When Deleuze talks about a problem, remember right at the beginning, I said that Deleuze has a very technical definition of problem. This is the technical definition of problem. Problems are those phase spaces. They are those attractor layouts, right? So we can create new problems. We can distribute those attractor layouts differently in order to think differently and construct new potentials and new possibilities for life. So the system of the future, Deleuze says, must be called a divine game where there's no pre-existing rule, since the game bears already upon its own rules, and since the child player can only win, all of chance being affirmed each time and for all times. So that is it. I'm going to stop sharing.
Wonderful.
That made sense. That was me navigating my own weird attractor layout of the second year of my PhD.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aragorn. Yeah, thank you for that. So we have, I'm sure there's lots of comments and questions. We have 10, perhaps 12 minutes. So I'll give everybody a chance to gather their thoughts, and you can either type your questions into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and we can dish them out that way. Yeah, Aragorn, I've always really enjoyed listening to you and your work, and there's so much to chew on here, so thank you so much. Do you know what keeps coming into my mind when you're talking about the dynamic systems theory and organism-oriented ontologies is Deleuze and Guattari's concept of schizoanalysis from Anti-Oedipus, and the notion of this idea of having to sort of destroy, if you like, or break down or break through, or maybe with a default mode, flatten the landscape enough to allow different ways of being to emerge. And I personally have found that going through that kind of experience has been quite difficult in some ways. And I just wanted to ask you quickly before I hand the floor over, thinking in terms of processual difference and a processual oriented ontology, how has that affected you in your own personal life and your own sense of identity, or has it? This sensing of this relationality that is so alien, really, to the because of the dogmatic image of thought. How's it affected you personally? I'm just wondering.
That's an interesting question. I do really like that you brought schizoanalysis into it, because what Deleuze and Guattari describe as the schizoanalytic project is very similar to what I was talking about in terms of phase spaces. So what they say is that there's a negative and a positive task of schizoanalysis. And the negative task is to get rid of all the ways, basically the dogmatic image, get rid of the ways in which your desire, they call it, has been structured by forces outside of your control, and redistribute desire differently, experiment with different ways in which desire can flow. And if we think about desire, we can really think about it as this energy landscape. We can think about it as this attractor topology, as this phase space. And there are often a bunch of attractors on that space, and we didn't set up all those attractors ourselves, right? But coming to grips with that attractor layout and the tendencies of thought that it drives us to, and tendencies of desire and action and everything else, and then figuring out how to arrange that attractor space differently is very much the schizoanalytic project, right? And it has political implications as well. And I'd say for me, to get to the personal part of the question, it's, Deleuze and Guattari, but this kind of broader thought in general, which I'd say originally probably came from psychedelics, because, I fell into the, as they say in Asterix and Obelix, I fell into the cauldron when I was a baby. So I probably took too many psychedelics when I was young or something. But it's kind of left me with this sort of incessant drive to kind of do that schizoanalytic task, to kind of always think not just in terms of the given, how the world is presented to me, but in terms of how the given is given, right? What underlies that presentation? What are the sort of like assumptions and dynamisms and tendencies, the biases and prejudices and dogmas and ideologies that kind of drive the ways in which I currently experience the world, and how can I experience it differently, right? So I always want to see the world in front of me as in terms of an open space of possibility, not unstructured, not a space of equivalence, not a totally smooth space, but a space that's more fluid, more deterritorialized than perhaps the sort of very territorialized space we often presented with. That makes sense. But this is why politically I'm an anarchist, though.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna take a little look at the chat, see if there's any hands up. Excuse me, everybody, I'm new to hosting and technology. Okay, so I don't see hands up as yet, but I do see some questions posted. I don't know if you can see them, Aragorn.
Yeah, should I just answer them?
Yeah, please, if you don't mind. I'll put my camera off as well.
So John, the good and common sense, I don't think it comes directly from Gramsci, but I think Deleuze traces these ideas. I don't know the terms themselves, but the underlying concepts, he's referring to everyone from Kant right back to the ancient Greeks. So common sense, his critique of common sense is also a critique of the critique of pure reason, right? And Kant's whole sort of transcendental deduction and everything else. Kant has this whole sort of architecture of the schemata and the categories and everything else. And this constrains thought in various ways. And for Deleuze, this surreptitiously traces the transcendental from the empirical. It traces the real conditions of experience from experience itself, which for Deleuze is a kind of philosophically illegitimate move for kind of quite obvious reasons that, it assumes that what's given to us in experience necessarily informs how it's given to us in experience. But yeah, these ideas of good and common sense, he traces back through the whole history of philosophy, really. Then there's an iPhone. It's someone whose name is iPhone. Instead of using psychedelics to modify the view of constraints, what about the role of meditation in having a different view of the dynamics and ontology of the systems? Absolutely. Psychedelics are only one way of smoothing space, of deterritorializing, or another way Deleuze and Guattari describe it is making yourself a body without organs. In 1,000 Plateaus, they explicitly talk about psychedelics, but they also talk about BDSM. They also talk about all these other methods of loosening up the usual strictures of thought and experience, of flattening that energy landscape, so that other possibilities, so that the flow between different states becomes easier. It's easier, you get a different view from inside a steep valley to the view you get from the top of a tall mountain. So the space of possibility that's open to you is always going to depend on what that energy landscape looks like and where you are in it in any given moment in time. And of course, practices like meditation, if you're doing Vipassana or something like that, that's certainly going to flatten that energy landscape in an interesting way and allow for the navigation of that space and the ability to redistribute that space possibly. And yes, breath work, so Stanislav Grof, who was an early psychedelics researcher, when LSD became criminalized, actually developed something called holotropic breath work that's meant as an alternative to LSD use that has quite powerful subjective effects. It triggers a lot of the same sort of unfolding as LSD does. Andrea, given that we exist in a world of ontological flux, how do we get stuck in habits in the first place? So, I don't know, maybe this is the Klineman. This is the fact that the atoms kind of swerve in the void a little bit, right? And they give rise to everything. But what happens is, if you look at like all these theorists who kind of looking at the origin of physics nowadays, we have these sort of initial sort of fundamental asymmetries in the world. And these asymmetries are everywhere from the sort of particulate level upwards. And there's these initial asymmetries and the recursive unfolding of these asymmetries, the implications of these nested recursive systems over time that give rise to all the complexity that we see in the world, right? So there's a guy named Stephen Wolfram who's got a project called Wolfram Physics, where he's kind of trying to derive all the possible rules of all possible universes and all the complex unfoldings of all those universes from just these basic fundamental asymmetries in the very sort of basics of matter, right? Using these very, very constrained mathematical architectures. And very, very, very simple starting conditions give rise to all sorts of different forms of emergent complexity. But it's the same as we can see in everything from sort of genetics to physics to everything else, right? Simple systems contain nonlinearities or initial asymmetries that give rise to complexity, right? So yeah, that half answers the question, but we contract habits as a natural sort of unfolding of the world, but there's always this tension between habit and the overcoming of habit, right? That seems to be that same tension between self-production and self-distinction, that we're always navigating that precarious relationship between dissipation and stasis.
Yeah, okay, thanks. There are actually two hands that have been up for quite a bit of while. Maybe we should just let, we have a very short time left, but maybe just let Ragnar and then Gary say their thing quick. Please be brief. Ragnar?
Hi. Yeah, it says host to stop my video, so I can't turn my video on.
Oh, apologies. I will, just too late. Maybe just chat.
Okay. So one of the well-known problems with the postmodern approach is that it sort of leads to a kind of relativism, or that's the accusation anyway. So in the context of your project, if everything is kind of in flux and fluid, then in a therapy context, for example, you've spoken about we can sort of change these habits and we can adapt these systems, and so there's this kind of we're tinkering with things, but in order to do that successfully, there has to be some sort of goal that you're working towards. You must have some idea of what you're trying to do, and that would invoke some sort of objective, non-fluid, but fixed standard, like eudaimonia or well-being or virtue, whatever it is you're trying to work towards. And if you're going to treat everything on a case-by-case basis and everything's in flux, it's hard to see how you can guide therapy in any sort of meaningful way. So how do you deal with that famous problem in moral philosophy?
Right. So, Guattari says this in a really beautiful way, right? And this is part of his sort of schizoanalytic project. And Guattari was, of course, a psychoanalyst. He worked at Laborde, which is a very famous radical psychiatric clinic in France. And he says the sort of, after we've sort of erased all these sort of forms of illegitimate normativity in the world, perhaps the only remaining norm we have is the continual processual enrichment of life, right? So, of course, everything's completely relative, right? We can't put the ethico-political cart in front of the onto-epistemological horse, right? But once we accept that premise that everything is relative, then it becomes relative to what, right? It doesn't become relative to everything and nothing. It becomes relative to a very particular context, which provides for a certain range of possibilities. And it's by exploring that space of possibility and determining how best we can sort of set our trajectories within that space, or how we can rearrange that space, that we're allowing for the continual processual enrichment of life. What makes it a really nice norm is that it's also an immanent norm of life, right? This is what the autopoietic theorists say. It's also what the philosopher of science, Hans Jonas, says, is that we have this immanent teleological drive to self-preserve, right? Life wants to do life. And we can see that in the unfolding of life itself. We don't need to impose any sort of transcendent norm on that. So if we just accept the continual processual enrichments of life as our norm, that can be very useful in a therapeutic session, right? If someone is kind of not thriving, then we have these very real sort of experimental possibilities, the schizoanalytic possibilities for, well, how can we explore your potential for thriving? How can we explore your attractor space? How can we rearrange the attractor topology differently in order for processual enrichment to unfold? That's the very bold summary of it.
But what are the standards of success? I mean, how do you know?
I'm sorry, we really just don't have time.
Okay.
We can continue these kinds of conversations. We'll keep continuing them. But there are a couple of people that seem, that need to get in there, and then we will, I'm afraid, have to stop. So Gary, very quickly, please. And then John, we'd like to hear from you too. You have done a lot of questions in the chat, and we'd like to actually hear your voice. Okay, quick, Gary.
Aragorn, thank you very much. That's a fantastic presentation and lots of things to go and think about. The one question is how does society rethink on this basis? So I get how you talk about individuals, but how do we get out of those patterned ways of thinking as a society in terms of approaching it in this way?
If I had the answer to that, so I'd probably be doing more exciting things with my time. But yeah, look, I mean, it actually goes to some of the previous question a little bit, because the very quick answer to where are the standards is that they're emergent, just like everything else, right? And we experiment with those and we construct those just like we experiment to construct everything else. So, how do we create an enriched, a more processually rich society? The underlying question there is not what are the sort of particular mechanisms by which we determine this, but how do we arrange the current world in such a way that everyone gets to participate in the construction of that more processually rich reality, right? So, typically, if you look at sort of everyone who's got an authoritarian political project, they always have a blueprint, they always have a plan. This is what I want the world to look like. But the underlying question is always, well, who gets to decide? How do we get people to come together in a better way so that we can allow for this wonderful pluripotent potential that we have in all these sort of emergent collective spaces to determine those answers as, as individuation, right? So instead of thinking just in terms of the individuated as defining the possibilities for collective life here and in the future, how do we allow for spaces of individuation where we can truly explore the potentials of the spaces we find ourselves in and what's open to us in the future? There's a very interesting Brazilian radical therapeutic practice called somatherapy, which I've written on recently. If you get hold of me afterwards, I'll send you the paper. But they're trying to answer that question through radical group therapy and political contestation.
Okay. John, okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I know there's no time. Thank you, Aragorn. Sorry to be off camera. Really cool talk. My question wasn't in a way exactly Gary's, so to try to put a different emphasis on it, it was, as I said in the chat, I'm stimulated by your talk to try to think of analogs to psychedelics in a social context without wanting to fall into what's the pill for the social problem, which is a fantasy. And I'm helped in that by thinking about something as literal and small as Stolpersteiner, right? Which I know others have pointed to previously to say it's something that just disrupts the flow, right? And for two reasons. One, partly because there are many people who hear what you're saying, Aragorn, and are like, I mean, they're probably not even listening, but if they do, they're like, yeah, no, actually, I wouldn't mind having some people give me some structure and some order, and I don't think we can put that all down to authoritarian projects, although those are very real and terrifying. It's a consequence. It's a consequence of this sort of these phase spaces and these attractors where people have gotten very used to and to some extent comfortable with these things. And so I guess what really interests me is, you know, the psychedelics are cool, the anarchist group is cool, the semitherapia group is cool. What really interests me is what is it that opens up those divergent flows that bring people to the point of even experimenting with these things. Because once you have a group up and running, right? So that's what's interesting, and I'm provoked to think further and to talk to you about what in the talk, you know, opens up those. I think the Deleuzian notion is lines of flight. Opens up those alternative flows, like creates those little self-reinforcing processes that add up to something, which then mean that someone comes to a moment of a new experience, which means maybe they'll go a different way.
Right. So yeah, I mean, and lines of flight in Deleuze and Guattari's work, lines of flight are those bifurcations, right? It's that point where we disrupting the current attractor layout and contracting a new attractor layout, right? In somatherapia, there's a very interesting distinction they make between autoregulation and heteroregulation. And they say we're used to living in a world that's heteroregulation, that's heteroregulated, right? Where all the structures that we navigate that give meaning and order to our lives are heteroregulated, right? They set out from somewhere outside of us. Very few of us have much agency over how the world is structured. And autoregulation is instead the principle of autonomy, or what's called autogestão in Brazil, self-management. And what it says is, well, we should have more agency over the structures that get to determine the salient aspects of our lives and the possibilities that inhere in those lives. So the more we practice these forms of auto-regulation, right, which is a collective project, and you can see sort of maybe bad examples of it in spaces like Africa Burn, for instance, but also what the situationists were trying to do. And in any sort of communal gathering that operates by a different logic, a temporary autonomous zone, for instance, they're all trying to create lines of flight. They're all trying to create what Deleuze would call nomadic war machines, right? Where we can contract different sets of social relations, flatten that attractor landscape, arrange a new attractor landscape. And we're doing so without any sort of a priori goal that's driving us, apart from that imminent processual enrichment of life. We're kind of experimenting as we go along. So they're necessarily experimental spaces, but they're not structureless, right? There's always a structure that we inhabit. The sort of topological phase space that we already inhabit is already determining these structures of our lives. But it's kind of we need a better way of sort of getting to grips, not with just with the explicit structures that determine the constraints of our lives, but with these more implicit structures, right? This is a very Foucauldian point, probably, right? To think about the particular episteme that we're in is another way of thinking about the attractor landscape. But yeah, constructing these spaces of possibility, if we got it right, then we'd be living in the wonderful, happy, utopian world we all want to live in. But we haven't, so we're obviously just experimenting as we go along. But thinking differently, thinking outside of the dogmatic image in whatever ways we can is obviously the sort of pretext to be able to achieve these kinds of more utopian goals.
Okay. Thank you so much, Aragorn. I think on that wonderful note, we may have to call this seminar to an end. It is 10 minutes over time, so otherwise we would just love to keep on chatting. So yeah, I believe we'll draw to a close, and our conversations will continue next week, I believe, on the 24th of April for our next presentation.
Yeah. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Aragorn. And I mean, yeah, indication of a highly successful seminar when people just want to keep talking and the host starts sweating. But yes, please, let's just carry on the conversation next week. I think that there's a whole lot of very interesting and exciting stuff to unpack. And yeah, we could actually chat to you for weeks still on this. So yeah, join us next week. And thanks so much, Emma. And thanks everybody for joining. It was a great talk.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. See you next
Thanks,
week.
Aragorn.
LSD is not water soluble, Gary. You can't put it in water.
Gary is saying put LSD in our drinking water. That was in the chat for everyone who's on the video and isn't reading the chat. So that's our solution. And thank you everyone for joining us. And now we do need to end it. Let's go drink that water. Okay. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Cheers.